Welcome to the NAHA webinar, brought to you by the National Association for Holistic Aromatherapy. To learn more about NAHA, please visit www.naha.org. Tonight's presentation topic is It's About Time, the Remarkable Thymus vulgaris. This educational webinar is being presented by Valerie Cooksley. Valerie is a holistic nurse, clinical aromatherapist, health researcher, and educator. She is also an acclaimed author of 8 books on aromatherapy and natural healing. Valerie was one of the founding members of the Steering Committee for Education Standards in Aromatherapy in the United States. She is the co-founder and director of the Institute of Integrative Aromatherapy located in Houston, Texas. She is also the president of Flora Medica and the Regional Network Director for the American Holistic Nurses Association, and is the founder of the Houston Holistic Network. Valerie is also the NAHA Regional Director for Texas. To learn more about Valerie, please visit her website at www.floramedica.com. And I'd like to take a moment and welcome Valerie this evening so she can go ahead and get started on her presentation about thyme.
Welcome everyone. It's good to have such a nice crowd tonight, and thank you, Kelly, for that wonderful introduction. So without further ado, I want to just say that being an integrative practitioner and a holistic nurse as well as a clinical aromatherapist, it's in my nature to embrace traditional wisdom and that mind-body philosophy. So I'm kind of combining the science, the clinical research in my practice and in my writing, as well as the holistic approach. So you're going to find this presentation very holistic in its perspective, okay? So I hope some of you took the time to go out and maybe pick some of the thyme growing in your garden. I had Kelly put that in the newsletter that went out, and I have a bunch of thyme here at my desk. Also, I prepared a hot herbal infusion, and you can use fresh or dried herb. It's always nice to also, not just with my lecture, but when other people lecture here on the NAHA webinars, I think it's a great idea to gather up your oils. I said all chemotypes were welcome tonight because we are going to be talking about 5 chemotypes from the Thymus vulgaris. But to have those things at hand, to kind of surround yourself with their energy and to be smelling them while I talk about them. And as I tell my students, it helps set up that scent memory association to help you remember these things as well. So the overview tonight, I'm going to be talking about the biotope, which is, where it grows and what the plant looks like, its features, the historical significance and use, traditional aromatic medicine and herbalism. We'll discuss aromatic topography, which is a term that I've coined in relationship to chemotypes and different aromatics and where they grow in the geography. We'll cover some evidence-based research, all the clinical applications that can apply to Thymus vulgaris, some new things that I'm sure you haven't heard about before. The association with the thymus gland. It's not by coincidence that it's called Thymus vulgaris, and it does relate to the thymus gland, and the bioenergetic aspects and some innovative applications, and then I will show you a recipe I put together for an immune-stimulating thyme bath. So let's talk about Thymus vulgaris, and it makes it real obvious when I list all the common names known worldwide. You can get an idea. Well, first of all, thyme belongs to the Lamiaceae family. It's the mint family. We know that it has a ton of aromatic plants in this family, but seeing the great number of also known as names: wild thyme, common thyme, garden thyme, mother of thyme, English thyme, French thyme, summer and winter thyme, running thyme, rub thyme, shepherd's thyme, thyme green. It's also called Our Lady's herb, and I'll mention that a little bit further down, but you can see it's across all cultures and geographic locales, but there's a large concentration in the Mediterranean basin where it's very well known. So it's a tiny leafed small plant. This one's in my garden, and it's a couple of feet wide. And this is a close-up. It has narrow oval-shaped leaves, delicate pink mauve flowers, and it's good to know this kind of thing, the biotope and how it grows, because it's going to point you to how the bioenergetics are going to relate to who you would use this on and for what kind of conditions later on in my talk. But it demands little from the soil. It grows well in stony ground. As a matter of fact, it grows better in stony, harsh soil than it does in a, if you put it in a garden with lots of fertilizer. I mean, sometimes it doesn't like that. It wants to be in the stony ground. It needs hardly any water. You can certainly overwater it and it won't do well. It flourishes in cosmic light and warmth, and this is going to be important when we see how it grows at higher altitudes. And there's over 100 species, varieties, and cultivars. Now the genus root, the origin is said to be found in the Indo-European derivation of dheu, D-H-E-U, and that means to rise in a cloud as dust, vapor, or smoke, and it can also be in relationship to the breath. And in the Greek, the root word is thymon, T-H-Y-M-O-N, and another derivative is from the Greek thymos, T-H-U-M-U-S, meaning courage, and this ties in with the thymus gland and the will to be well. Historical use. So I try to get a couple of pictures here to make it more visual, but Thymus vulgaris is rich in history and lore, and especially when you see that many common names, and it's in the whole Mediterranean basin. But in the Middle Ages, the herb was woven into scarves for knights, and King Charlemagne declared a series of decrees commanding that this aromatic herb be planted in the gardens, at monasteries, and all his royal estates. So that was how important this herb was. The herb was placed beneath pillows to aid sleep and to prevent nightmares. It was placed on coffins during funerals to assure safe passage into the next life. Roman soldiers bathed with it in herbal infusions before battle to make them more courageous. Also in Sanskrit, dhumo, D-H-U-M-O, denotes smoke or vapor, and in Latin the derivative is fumus. And in English, fume, fumigate, and perfume. And I'm mentioning all this because it ties in. The herb thyme was burned as incense in sacred temples, and it was utilized again in the bath as a general tonic and disinfectant. And just a little aside personal story, I mean, I have memories of time when I was a young child growing up in Massachusetts on a farm in the Berkshires, and we'd go to church every Sunday, and on the way back from church we'd pass the cemetery, and coming from an Italian big family, we always stopped at the grave and prayed and just showed respects or put flowers on the grave. But there was thyme, creeping thyme, growing everywhere in this patch of the old graveyard where the Gennaries were. And so I had this really, really fond personal memory of this sharp but warm herbal aroma growing freely on the lawn there in the cemetery. And then when I researched this, and I find that it was related to sacred temples, and it was put on coffins, and it was burned as incense for to help them pass into the next life. It was like maybe this just wasn't by chance that it was planted there. So it's pretty interesting. So I show you, the Roman soldiers and the coffins and the monastery gardens here. So let's see how early physicians used thyme. And this is mostly the herb thyme, so I'm combining some of the herbal knowledge, and then we'll get into the aromatic, medicinal, and the essential oil uses. But early physicians used it to fumigate. That was an early way of using herbs as medicine to cleanse an area, a household, or even an individual. And Hippocrates favored thyme's therapeutic uses in treating all types of respiratory ailments, and this is Hippocrates here. And Theophrastus here, and Dioscorides prescribed it, and they used it for calming convulsions, reducing inflammation, relaxing spasms of all kinds. And then the ancient Egyptians used thyme for embalming the dead, and the early Greeks employed it for relaxing and hygienic benefits, while the Romans added thyme to not only their baths, but they added it to cheese and alcoholic beverages because they felt it was very health protective as a flavoring. Here we're looking at traditional aromatic medicine and herbalism, and in the Baltic countries they call it Our Lady's herb. Now I'm breaking it down into the infusion here, so an herbal tea infusion type of thing, the herb itself, and then the essential oil. So let's kind of go through some of these ways that it was used in aromatic medicine and herbalism. You can see it has a wide spectrum of pharmacological properties, and it's used in traditional medicine for thousands of years. The North American Indians made it into an infusion for fevers and chills. Also, it was used for sinus and colds and things of that nature. And even today, the Hispanic culture uses thyme tea for colds and sinus infections. And I spend part of the time in Puerto Vallarta, and they simply just have thyme in the pharmacies, and it's a very inexpensive herb for these third world countries, and still used in this way for colds and sinus infections. And then I bought some, it's called Thymo Bianco, and it's a Thymus vulgaris mixed with olive oil in Italy, and you'll use that to rub on your chest for these kind of chest and bronchial kind of colds. It's also used for toothache and nerve pain, spasms of the stomach, whooping cough, shortness of breath. Oh, and I have a story to say about whooping cough. It was going around a few years ago, and an aromatherapist friend of mine had a friend whose child had whooping cough, so they consulted with me, and I used the thyme linalool, which is safe to use with children, but it's specific for whooping cough, and they did not have to go on to antibiotics. It's great for gout and insomnia, and remember, insomnia, they put the thyme on pillows and inside pillows to help with sleep. It's also used during childbirth to hasten delivery and various skin and respiratory ailments. The herb, doing some of this research, wasn't aware, but it's a main ingredient in the herbal cigarette, and it's used for stomach upset, fatigue, and headache to smoke this herbal cigarette with thyme. And then the essential oil is used as a local anesthetic, and in the early 1900s, before the introduction of modern antibiotics, the oil was used for wound care, and they would soak the medicament, which had the thyme oil in it, in a wool gauze and used it as a dressing. And in another slide here, I'll be speaking how Dr. Valerie used it. So we're going to talk about 5 chemotypes that I'll be presenting in this lecture. And I love this photo. It's a little chameleon, and he's got some test tubes here. But Kurt Snowbelt, who's a German aromatherapist who teaches at the Pacific Institute of Aromatherapy, he was my very first aromatherapy course that I took here in the United States. And being a chemist, he has termed Thymus vulgaris as the chemical chameleon, and I just love that term, and I love that depiction. And so I showed him this photo, and I gave a lecture on thyme and how it relates to the thymus gland at the last conference, and at the scientific conference in San Francisco. So I went more into depth than I am here about the thymus gland, and less on the Thymus vulgaris essential oils, which I am doing more at this lecture. So these are the 5 main chemotypes we're discussing tonight: thymol, paracymene, thuyonol, geraniol, and linalool. And This Thymus vulgaris is among the most studied essential oil species. Its principal component, thymol, has been shown to be antifungal, antibacterial, antioxidant, and let's see where this grows, because this is interesting. And I've put this together, and I call it Aromatic Topography. And I coined the term because I'm kind of gathering the map, geography, kind of topography meaning, but putting it together, we're looking at the natural and artificial physical features of an area that applies to maps and geography, but applying it to the aromatics, and specifically the chemotypes, in this case, of where these plants grow and how the chemistry changes as we go further up, and in this case, a mountain. Now, as aromatherapists, we know there's several variables to consider when looking at an essential oil's biological property, such as the phenological stage, the plant harvest time, ecological factors, environmental conditions, but the chemical profile of each plant species will be expressed differently depending on these factors. Now, what I show here is thymol, and this is at sea level. So this is how I remember it. I try to play these little games with myself because I'm not really one that's got a natural aptitude for chemistry. And so, and I like to teach this way, but the thymol is very high in phenols. That's what makes it hot, and this is what makes the Thymus vulgaris species kind of tricky to work with. You got to know which chemotype you have. But I think about how plants cannot move on their own. They stay put, right? They're not like an animal and they can run away from a predator. So for them to avoid insects and animals, etc., they have to produce secondary metabolites, or what we know as essential oils, to fend off these predators so the plant can survive. So to help you remember, thymol is the hot oil, the one you have to be most cautious with. It's not very safe to use in a lot of instances. You have to really dilute it. And so think of it like that's the hottest oil, and that's the, the most extreme in the phenol content because it's down at sea level. As we move up the mountain, we have paracymene, then we have thionol, geraniol, and linalool. Now, linalool chemotype is at the highest altitude. So I like to kind of think of this as the safest. I mean, it is the safest, but also it's, it's got less animals up here, less insects, at this higher altitude, but also it's closer to the more cosmic light. It's closer to the heavens. So I kind of help it to remember in my mind, it's safe for little angels. It's safe for kids, okay? So linalool is the safest. So we're going to be talking about all of these here. So first we'll look at the chemotype thymol. So it's all the same species, Thymus vulgaris, and this one grows wild. It's distilled from flowers and leaves, grown at the lowest altitude at or near sea level. It's produced in Spain, Germany, Turkey, and Zimbabwe, as well as France. And France has, popularized, and they chemotype everything there. So, these are the 5 chemotypes from Provence, France that I'm describing tonight. This chemotype is very stimulating due to its high phenol content in what we call a hot oil. And even when you smell the oil, and if some of you do have your oils, handy, and as I do, I have my Thymus vulgaris thymol here, and when I smell it, it definitely has this sharp, penetrating, almost like a fire, a hot, sharp scent to it, and it's due to these high phenols. And it almost smells like iron or a metallic smell, and it is related to the iron element. It's both phenolic compounds, thymol and carvacrol, are highly irritant. So this is like really important. It's got to be highly diluted if you're going to use it. The maximum dermal use is 1% or less. It's powerfully strong anti-infectious agent, potent antioxidant, and what you're going to find is many of the high phenol oils are going to be automatically antioxidant. They kind of go hand in hand. But this one's anti-inflammatory, analgesic, and a wound healing agent as well. There is some possible drug interaction because it may inhibit clotting. So if someone was on a blood thinner, you would want to be careful with this one and not use it because we have other chemotypes to choose from. So this is kind of starting from the ground, and so I say sea level, and we're working our way up as I go through the different chemotypes. Thymol is a crystalline phenol. It occurs naturally in thyme plants, and it's utilized as a fungicide, a flavoring, a reagent, a preservative, as well as a perfume ingredient. And it's part of a class of compounds called biocides, and that means it's a substance capable of destroying harmful organisms. So again, think of it as this is at sea level where there's more insects and critters and animals, and that's how it defends itself. And you may have already, if you've ever tried Listerine, the commercial mouthwash Listerine, if you look on the label, on the back it'll show you eucalyptol, menthol, methyl salicylate, but then the last ingredient is thymol. And it is such a small dilution. It's a 0.064%. So they are using it 0.06%. So when I say, and when Tisserand in his essential oil book says maximum dermal use is 1% or less, you really, that's all you need, because you know how powerful Listerine is. You don't, it's very powerful. And I did want to mention that a different species of Thymus, Thymus ciliatus, is the highest thymol producing essential oil, and there's many studies on thymol, just on the isolated constituent. Now let's look at thyme chemotype paracymene, and this, if you have it handy, this one, I have an organic one here, Thymus vulgaris paracymene, and this is from France, and this one has a much sweeter and somewhat of a green note, and so you can tell it's up higher on the mountain, and this is going to be a little bit safer to use. Again, it's distilled from the flowers and leaves. It's slightly above sea level. It's a precursor to the constituent of thymol and cowrecrol, so that's interesting. It's not going to be as harsh. It's stimulating but not too irritating, so it's less hot and easier to use, and it does not burn. It's a very effective antibacterial agent. It's only produced for medical aromatherapy, and it's primarily utilized by the French medical doctors, and they use it topically for arthritis and some nerve pain and sciatica, that sort of thing. And about midway point on the mountain, at elevation, we're now looking at thuyonol. It can also be spelled this way with the Y, but this is the most common. But it is distilled from the leaves at mid-altitude, so a midway point. It's a gentler character, and it's the least aggressive compared to the phenol-rich thyme. So now halfway up the mountain, we're kind of getting away from the phenol-rich contents. It's non-toxic and non-irritating. It's well suited for oral use, and it does not cause irritation. Now, I want to mention that, you have to be a medical doctor to prescribe essential oils by oral use. I've been trained, in 7 different aromatherapy schools, and many over in France and Germany, and I can tell you that it's not like essential oils are frivolously used in oral use. It's very specific, mostly to fight an infection, and it's prescribed by doctors. So even though it says here well suited for oral use, you can use it in a mouthwash. So I'm talking in that regard. It's safe to use topically, and it's safe on the mucous membranes and skin if diluted. It's only produced for medical aromatherapy. You're not going to find this in a typical mail order or internet. You have to research for this particular one. It's known as a broad spectrum antiviral, antibacterial essential oil. The interesting thing about the thuyonol, it is neurotoxic, and it stimulates the central nervous system, and It does help with the treatment of mild depression and fatigue, and that's where the central nervous system comes in here. But because it's neurotonic, you do want to be careful with diffusing it. Now CT geraniol, and I do not have that one handy, but that one has a slightly rose geranium note to that chemotype. It's a little bit sweeter, a little more floral, and again, we're going up the elevation here. So let's look at this one. It's distilled from the flowers and leaves from cloned plants at a high elevation. It's balanced proportions of geraniol and linalool. It's safest for skin applications. It's well suited for children because of its gentle and non-irritating quality. And this is the first level and the first chemotype that has a GRAS listing, a GRAS status, generally regarded as safe listing. It does have possible drug interactions, and it may be colorectic, and that means a substance that can increase the volume and secretion of bile from the liver. There's only two chemotypes that are on the GRAS listing. This one, geraniol, and also the next one, which is my favorite and the one I use most often. This is Thyme CT linalool. It's distilled from flowers and leaves. This is at the highest altitude, 1,000 to 1,200 meters, high elevation. Very high linalool content and linalool acetate composition. It's very mild, non-irritant, yet it's highly antibacterial and antifungal. It's ideal for skin application and internal use, and as I mentioned, it has the GRAS status. It's considered very mild and safe to use with children. So that mental imagery I had, you know, the little angels up at the top of the mountain, it's the safest for them, and stay away from the lower high phenol content ones. And this one's excellent for viral infections, lower respiratory. It's got a very mild character, and it's got an affinity for the bronchial area. So I've used thyme tea, an infusion of thyme for bronchitis. I mentioned that I use the linalool type for whooping cough in children. It's been used a great deal for pneumonia, especially, you know, walking pneumonia, and think about the dry pneumonia with the dry cough. And you can use it homeopathically as well. I've seen it used for lung cancers, for primary lung cancers, and I go back to thinking, especially if people don't want it, like I know of this one case that I consulted with who had a primary lung tumor, and she did not like to drink much water. She had these growths in her lungs, and she was a type of, I would say, a hardened type person, and, you know, kind of bitter, hardened, and she lived and her house was like very dark, and so I put it together. I mean, it was very much like time was calling for her. And we look back at the biotope. It grows in stony ground, and she had stony growths, hardened ground, and she was a hardened person. It brings cosmic light and warmth to someone, and she was a cold, kind of dark person and lived in a dark house, and remember, it didn't need much water. So there was just some of these things that pointed to that, and she was given it homeopathically. So let's see how Thymus vulgaris is used in clinical aromatherapy, and this was the quote I wanted to reference, Dr. Jean Valnet. He had this to say about thyme. Thyme is one of the herbs especially blessed with a large number of therapeutic properties, and if you've read his books, he used it extensively. And we see in clinical aromatherapy it's used for topical applications, so we can use it in compresses, ointments. You can make an ointment with the different varieties of the chemotypes of thyme and put it over the thymus gland to help stimulate the immune system. It's used in skincare, massage, and baths, and I'm going to be showing you a bath. It can be used in inhalation, both direct and indirect, but I want to point out that you would not want to use the thymol chemotype because of the central nervous system effects I mentioned earlier. It's prescribed internally by physicians. Safe practice guidelines recommend 1 to 2% dilutions for topical applications, but as I pointed out earlier, with the thymol, the high phenol, you want to use 1% or less. It's contraindicated with those with hypertension and epilepsy. So you want to avoid in those cases, especially with the epilepsy with the thymol because of the central nervous system stimulation. And also there's some information on hyperthyroid that if you had a hyperthyroid client, you would not want to use thyme consistently over a long period of time because it can affect the thyroid. In French aromatic medicine and endobiogeny, Dr. Durford and Dr. Lapraz use thyme to treat chlamydia infections. They say it helps regenerate liver cells in their book, Aromatherapy exactement, and for mild depression and fatigue as well as arthritis. So those are some of the conditions, but also for colic, sore throat, I mentioned whooping cough, bronchitis, but stomach aches, flatulence, bedwetting, diarrhea, and it helps increase urine production. So, you know, if you're sipping your thyme tea, you might find that after this lecture, you might have to use the restroom because it is producing more urine. Now, as far as contraindications, Jane Buckle says in oral high doses it's possible to affect the thyroid, and Zevin in 1997 made reference to that as well in some research studies. So taken internally, it could possibly overstimulate the thyroid in high doses. So evidence-based research for Thymus and on the clinical applications. So I went on the National Institutes of Health database, PubMed, and found over 400 research studies on Thymus vulgaris essential oil. And then there was about 24 different Thymus species that were also listed that were identified for essential oil research. And, you know, so it wasn't specifically Thymus vulgaris, but some very new species are being studied for different things. So I culminated all of this on a slide here for you to kind of give you an idea of some of these new areas where these this evidence-based research is starting to be applied in the clinical situation. So lowering LDLs, it was Thymus cerefalum, and that particular oil was shown to lower LDL, treating hypertension, improving cognitive impairments, and that was related to thymol and cabracrol specifically. And then treating various cancers. Colon cancer was specific to the Thymus masticina, and then breast cancer was another yet different Thymus, but many Thymus vulgaris essential oils have been proven to show how they can treat bacterial infections, and we're talking about Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Enterococcus, E. coli, Pseudomonas, again related to the pneumonia, and MRSA. And then acne, it's used to treat acne, and several studies are showing specific, it's a propion bacterium acne, and that's the bacterium that causes the condition. And then, believe it or not, preventing West Nile virus. Several research studies came up because it works against or affects the vector, Aedes albopicus, and that's the primary source of transmission for the West Nile virus. So it affects the vector, so it can help prevent the West Nile virus. And then treating black mold and different yeast infections and Candida albicans, but especially the black mold, which is problematic here in Houston and in the southern states, the Aspergillus niger, and it's effective against that. So some really exciting, like I said, over 400 research studies, and it's very promising. Now, it's interesting to note when you look at all this together, I try to find patterns to help me remember what this is useful for and where it's acclimated towards. And you'll see that primary areas are the heart, so we have the LDLs and hypertension and circulation, but also the brain, the cognitive, and that relates to, it's definitely antioxidant, and the immune system, because look how many cancers it can help with. And then definitely antimicrobial, because it's against a whole host of bacteria, fungus, and viruses over here. So Thymus species in the thymus gland. I mean, is there a correlation? Is it just by coincidence that the name is the same in the etiology? Well, if you look at the doctrine of signatures, and this is also looking at correlations between and how they used to credit how an herb or root or something would be applied in medicine. And it was presumed that Galen in the 2nd century thought that the thymus gland looked an awful like a bunch of thyme. And I couldn't, find a better picture than putting these together. So this was the closest I came up with. But it hasn't been until recently, like the 1960s, did the thymus gland this is the thymus gland, even start getting studied. Up till then they just kind of ignored it and didn't think it did a whole lot. And but it is very important in the role of maturation of the immune system and the immune cells, and it releases thymosin, and it helps develop an optimal immune system. And I blew up a picture of Thymus vulgaris leaves, and you can see the correlation here, and then the pink mauve flowers, and how this is a cross-section of the thymus, and you can see the medulla, how it does look similar to that. But there is a correlation between the thymus gland and its key role in our health and our immune system and the thymus vulgaris. And the thymus gland happens to control life energy of the body as well as the immune system. So let's take a look at the bioenergetics. So again, I'm coming from a holistic perspective. Yes, I want the clinical research and the science, and but I also look at the bioenergetics and the spiritual aspects and the doctrine of signatures, and looking holistically at the person and what's their character like, and putting all the pieces together. And it's not by chance that I chose this picture with the little honeybee on the thyme, because bees love thyme. And it's connected to all this astral energy because bees are an animal, and it's connected to the heat, fire, and aggression from the astral energy. And I'm kind of talking about anthroposophic terms here. But in general, the bioenergetic aspects of Thymus vulgaris is it increases chi, it stimulates warmth, and remember, it grows high up on the mountain. It has even the phenol, you can say, is hot. It creates warmth, but it loves the warmth, cosmic environment up at the top of the mountain in high elevations. So therefore it dispels cold conditions, it tonifies the heart, it strengthens the heartbeat, it increases the warmth organism, and it helps fortify the I principle. And the animal principle, or this I principle, it's also responsible for things like instincts, desires, passions, attractions, repulsions, movement, kind of this astral animal body. And the conscious state, it facilitates this animal life, humanness, and makes it possible. So according to Dr. Burkowski, who teaches spiritual phytoessencing and who I studied with for seems like forever, like 13 years. He's a wonderful teacher in speaking about this bioenergetic and the spiritual aspects, and he describes Thymus vulgaris essential oil as being one of the most powerful immune system remedies as well. And he states that thyme has a positive effect on the thymus gland too. And he notes the reference to life force and the heart and warmth and the I principle, and how all this ties in with the thymus gland. So it's very interesting And again, the bioenergetics and the spiritual aspects of the herb, we should be looking at that, not just clinically and just the chemotype and just being in the laboratory, right? We want to look at how it grows and these other aspects to get a complete picture. And especially when you have several chemotypes to choose from, you can, really narrow it down to using the correct one with your client, doing a consultation. So let's look at some innovative applications of using essential oil therapy, and I'm narrowed it down to Thymus support because of this relationship, and I can only give a few examples here, and I'll be showing a bath. But one of my favorite things is to use aromatic castor oil packs, and I was personally trained in naturopathic principles and practices, and I found that the castor oil pack is immensely beneficial for numerous ailments, but especially providing thymus support. So if you have somebody who has a really low will to live, or not wanting to embark in self-healing kind of thing, or has a low immune system, you can work with the Thymus vulgaris species with the castor oil pack and using it like over the thymus gland. And the castor oil pack was originally promoted by Edgar Cayce, and it happens to be rich in unsaturated fatty acids. It possesses potent anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and all kinds of immune-enhancing properties, and it's been used for centuries for its therapeutic effect. So when you blend that, castor oil is useful just on its own, but then you use it with Thymus vulgaris in a specific one or two chemotypes, you can see how much more powerful that topical application is going to be. And this can be beneficial during extreme stress, or let's say somebody's just starting to get sick. That's when you want to use it, not at the end, but in the beginning, and that's where herbs and essential oils and all these things work best. And fundamentally, I mentioned any essential oil that's going to contain the phenols are going to be antioxidant, and they're going to be the free radical scavengers. So they'll have those properties that will help in the immune stimulating field. But you always have to remember those phenols are hot, and you have to have safe practice and caution are going to be really paramount. So another way you can use these are a massage oil concentrate to reflex points in the thymus gland, so you can put it directly over the thymus gland, or on reflex points on the feet, CV17, the Sea of Tranquility, you could put it over that point. And also, believe it or not, certain teeth are related to the thymus gland, so you can be working from different angles. So I'll show you an example in a few minutes. I'm mentioning here the aromatic bath soaks and oil dispersion bath therapy, and I'm one of 12 nurses in the United States that are certified in oil dispersion bath therapy, and it's a German homeopathic anthroposophic type medicine, and it was a 2-year certification and very extensive, and I show you the apparatus down here, and it creates a vortex with the pressure of the water, and you mix the essential oil with a vegetable oil such as olive oil, and it becomes whipped around in this vortex, and it becomes nanoparticle size, where the oil doesn't typically mix with water, as we know, but it does mix in this vortex. And the bath, I have a Thyme bath here, it will mix, and then we have a certain brush technique to help stimulate that warmth and the eye principle for patients, and Thyme is used in the oil dispersion bath therapy over in Germany. And then also herbal infusion, drinking tea, which I hope you're sipping on during this lecture here. So I want to show you an example of an aromatic bath recipe that I've used many times. And it might look kind of complex, but I like to come from different angles, and again, a holistic perspective. So I call this an immune stimulating Thyme bath. And you can see here I'm doing a combination of the herb with some essential oils. And we're going to create hydrotherapy here using heat and hyperthermia, as well as the essential oils and the herbs here. So 2 cups of fresh Thymus vulgaris herb. So if you have it growing, you know, you just go out and pick it. You'd bring the water to a boil in a stainless steel or a glass pot. Add the herb and cover and remove and let it steep for at least 10 minutes. So it's like making an herbal tea for your bath. But strain it so all the little, you know, stems and stuff don't go down the drain. But you could use dried if you didn't have the fresh herb, and I would recommend using maybe a half a cup of the dried herb and go through the same process for creating the bath infusion. Then I include 2 cups of Epsom salt or magnesium flakes, and this is going to give you the benefit of the magnesium to relax the body, but it's also the carrier for these essential oils. So we have 2 drops. These are all essential oils: Thymus vulgaris, Chemotype linalool, Fregonia, Kunzia, and 2 drops of lemon. So that's 8 drops total, and I put the drops directly on the Epsom salt or the magnesium flakes and then add it to the bath. So this is the carrier. And then I add a half a cup of fresh lemon juice, and it's just very refreshing. It creates a slightly acidic pH, which is perfect for the skin because you want that to be about a 7.5. And lemon itself is antibacterial, so it's a really nice combination. And here's the bath at my home. It's got a slight, you know, herbal green tinge to it. And you soak for 15 to 20 minutes in a warm to hot bath. So you don't want to make it too hot where it raises your blood pressure and you start sweating, but you want it to be warmer than body temperature. And then it's nice to not even dry off, but wrap yourself in a cotton house robe and then get into bed, and then you will sweat, because the Thymus vulgaris not only increases urine production and stimulates your immune system, but you will start to sweat. And these are all wonderful immune system stimulating essential oils, but we're using a small amount. 8 drops per bath plus the herbal tea is a really nice antibacterial, antiviral bath, stimulating the immune system response. And so if you're starting to feel a little under the weather or feel a cold coming on and you're not feverish or sick yet, this would be ideal, you know. And you can also sip your herbal tea of thyme while you're in there. And it's a wonderful thing. And, you know, there's lots of studies coming out on the benefits of hyperthermia for curing cancers, for any serious condition. You want to stimulate the body so it can rev up and want to fight off. And would also be a good one to use, those grass status essentials, and they're going to be okay for the mucous membranes and the skin, so always think safety here. And you know, 8 drops, when you pick the correct oils and then you got this combination, it's wonderful. You don't have to overdo. I always kind of go with an 8 to 10 drop essential oils per bath. So in closing, I've gone a little bit fast here. I've covered a lot, but I just trust that this webinar has given you, I hope, a comprehensive understanding of the remarkable Thymus vulgaris, both as a botanical herb and especially as an essential oil with its unique and distinctive chemotypes, which makes it very unique, and how you can use aromatherapy as a practitioner to choose the best chemotype, the most effective chemotype for specific conditions. And we really are truly blessed to have such a widely researched essential oil in our medicine bag. So I thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie. That was wonderful. I think I'm going to look at my thyme a lot differently. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and stop the recording.